Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
A few of those passages brought me pain, unwelcome pain, and one of them was about the security theater. You would think that if you had to defend our current arrangements, which are presumably going to continue until the end of space and time, you would say that, well, they may be uncomfortable, but at least they make us stronger. But instead, what Bush said was, well, we may still be weak, but at least we're more comfortable, which is just the opposite of sort of the messaging that you would want to hear, even just as a stab at trying to justify what we almost endure every time we travel by air. But more substantively than that, out of one side of his mouth, he says that the bad guys in America don't like pluralism. And then he turns around and laments the increased clashes among cultures in America. And it's like, that's pluralism, my friends.
Welcome, everyone, to the Roundtable. It's good to be back in the host chair. Thanks, as always, to Spencer for picking up so much slack over the summer months. I'm Ryan Williams, your host, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of Claremont Review Books and The American Mind. I'm joined by James Pullis, executive editor of The American Mind, Matthew Peterson, founding editor of The American Mind, vice president of education, and Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. Seth Barron is out for reasons of religious liberty. I won't elaborate. With all that, we wanted to talk about, of course, the biggest story currently winding its way through our what seems to be a week in, week out national pathological freakout on both sides of the aisle. That is this report, just alleged for now, but seems to in various ways have been confirmed, kind of, sort of. This excerpt from Bob Woodward and Robert Costa's new book, Peril, which is about the end of the Trump presidency. And I will just read the opening page and a half of this because there's really no substitute for the full account. Now, I'll add that this comes from a sympathetic reporter at the Washington Post. This is a classic, flog your book ahead of its release kind of comms plan. So it's sympathetic. It adopts the premises of the book and the journalists who wrote the book. And as you'll see, the premises of our ruling class, bipartisan as it is in so many ways. So here it is. The headline for this from Washington Post is Top General was so fearful Trump might spark war that he made secret calls to his Chinese counterpart. So twice in the final months of the Trump administration, the country's top military officer was so fearful that the president's actions might spark a war with China that he moved urgently to avert armed conflict. In a pair of secret phone calls, General Mark A. Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, assured his Chinese counterpart, General Li Zhuocheng of the People's Liberation Army, that the United States would not strike. According to a new book, I said who it was from. One call took place on October 30th, 2020, 4 days before the election that unseated President Donald Trump, and the other on January 8th, 2 days after the Capitol siege carried out by his supporters in a quest to cancel the vote. The first call was prompted by Milley's review of intelligence suggesting the Chinese believed that the United States was preparing to attack. That belief, the author's write, was based on tensions over military exercises in the South China Sea and deepened by Trump's belligerent rhetoric toward China. General Lee, I want to assure you that the American government is stable and everything is going to be okay, Milley told him. We are not going to attack or conduct any kinetic operations against you. In the book's account, Milley went so far as to pledge he would alert his counterpart in the event of a U.S. attack. Stressing the rapport they'd established through a back channel, General Lee, you and I have known each other for now 5 years. If we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. Lee took the chairman at his word. Milley, finishing that sentence, he said, if we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. It's not going to be a surprise. Lee took the chairman at his word. The authors write in the book, Peril, which is set to be released next week. In the second call, placed to address Chinese fears about the events of January 6th, Lee wasn't as easily assuaged. Even after Milley promised him, "We are 100% steady, everything's fine, but democracy can be sloppy sometimes." Lee remained rattled, blah, blah, blah. Milley apparently called Pelosi, this is fine, just riffing on it, saying that clearly Trump was crazy and notifying her of his intentions. He also, this is now reading again from the article, just two more short paragraphs. Milley also summoned senior officers to review the procedures for launching nuclear weapons, saying the president alone could give the order, but crucially that he, Milley, also had to be involved. Looking each in the eye, Milley asked the officers to affirm that they had understood the author's right in what he considered, that is Milley, an oath. The chairman knew that he was pulling a Schlesinger, the author's right, resorting to measures resembling the ones taken in August 1974 by James Schlesinger, the defense secretary at the time. Schlesinger told military officials to check with him and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs before carrying out orders from President Richard M. Nixon, who was facing impeachment at the time. Though Milley went furthest in seeking to stave off a national security crisis, his alarm was shared throughout the highest ranks of the administration. CIA Director Gina Haspel, for instance, reportedly told Milley, "We're on the way to a right-wing coup." And at the very end of the article, Milley, who never misses an opportunity to burnish his deep learning, it's the way these things work. Our seasoned listeners know this, of course, but for those of you not familiar with this is always an elaborate attempt in these kinds of books. So this is it's a mutual back scratching exercise. Woodward gets good sources, and he gets to burnish your reputation, and you get to take the first cut at revising how history will see you, because you get to kind of write it through Woodward. So this is the final two paragraphs. The general, that is Milley, saw parallels between January 6th and the 1905 Russian Revolution, which set off unrest throughout the Russian Empire, and though it failed, helped create the conditions for the October Revolution of 1917, in which the Bolsheviks executed a successful coup that set up the world's first communist state. Vladimir Lenin, who led the revolution, called 1905 a dress rehearsal. Those historical facts are true, but Milley's interpretation is what's interesting. Finally, a similar logic could apply with January 6th. Milley thought as he wrestled with the meaning of that day, telling senior staff what you might have seen was a precursor to something far worse down the road. So this is all pretty extraordinary. Philip Wegman, a former Publius Fellow, actually, who covers the White House, tweeted this from Jen Psaki when she was asked about this. The press secretary's response was, "It is the obligation of every chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to follow constitutional orders to prevent unlawful military actions." She said, again, in context is important. The former president was implementing an insurrection. So that's not exactly a denial from the White House. This is apparently going to be their line on this. This whole episode is pretty extraordinary. The comparison to Nixon is pretty apt, actually, because that was the last time I think we would argue, and we have argued, our colleague John Marie argued decades ago, that was the Nixon and Trump parallels are pretty similar in the sense that the deep state decided they both had to go, and in various different ways orchestrated their ouster. I'm not saying the deep state rigged the election, but they did do everything they could to delegitimize Trump, to conduct a relentless media war against him while he was in office, and thus to decrease his chances of re-election. But I'll stop after this, but this is pretty revealing to me, because it suggests that what we've known for a long time, which is that the normal constitutional small r Republican way of doing things in this country, that is, presidents get to rule over their generals. They're the ones elected. They're the ones who take the only oath that's actually listed in the Constitution, whereas the generals and everyone else take oaths that were put there by Congress, another duly elected branch of the federal government. This is kind of gets everything backwards, but revelations of all this is being met from by the mainstream media with a kind of a yawn or well, it's a good thing he did this. So this is just of a piece with our upside down constitutional world these days.
It's fun to see that these guys finally met a General Lee they don't want to tear down. I mean, the 1905 comparison is an intriguing one, because after all, it was the Germans who sent Lenin into Russia to cause the mischief which he executed on so very well. If there was going to be some kind of public unrest in the United States focused on actually overthrowing the government, you can bet that the Chinese would be backing that kind of undertaking. I think it would be safe to say it would be in their interest to do so at the very least. And yet, Milley and his crew seem to have no fear of Chinese interference in American domestic affairs. If they harbor such concerns, they definitely don't talk about them or evince any activity that would suggest they take them seriously. They seem to think that the Chinese are the sort of folks who you can call up and have a chummy conversation about undermining your own form of government in the name of "quote unquote" our democracy. So, I find it intriguing to think about who overseas would be involved in what way if there were indeed domestic unrest. It certainly seems like there are enough woke foot soldiers for China to play with if they were so inclined. But all this stuff seems to be off the radar of Milley and company to their detriment and their discredit. These guys have been at the top of the pile for a long time, and their track record in foreign affairs leaves a lot to be desired, to say the very least.
As the, I think the oldest person on this podcast, the ancient elder statesman of the group, I'm old enough to remember way back when we at Claremont were reviled as extremists for suggesting, via a piece by Michael Anton before the election called "The Coming Coup," which I recall broke the internet, for suggesting that perhaps the military might not be entirely on board with our constitutional order and should be suspected of perhaps being willing to perform this kind of coup-adjacent activity. I'm reading now from this piece, which was back in almost a year ago now, more than a year ago, in fact. It started, Anton says, with the military brass quietly indicating that the troops should not follow a presidential order. They were bolstered by many former generals, including President Trump's own first Secretary of Defense, who stated openly what the brass would only hint at. Then, as nationwide riots really got rolling in early June, the sitting Secretary of Defense himself all but publicly told the president not to invoke the Insurrection Act. His implicit message was, "Mr. President, don't tell us to do that because we won't," and you know what happens after that. It's fitting that this paragraph and this suggestion was subject to exactly the kind of celebration parallax that Mike Anton is famous for pointing out. This isn't happening. Oh, and it's good that it is. I mean, now it's basically clear that that's exactly what the military-industrial complex and the bureaucratic leaders of our military, aka the military arm of our monoparty ruling class, is willing and ready to do at any moment. And philosophically, I think they're more in line with China than with America. The reason that this is not shocking to the lackeys of the ruling class in the press is because they ultimately have already plunked for a global world order, which is more in line with Davos and Klaus Schwab than with James Madison and the American Constitution. It's perfectly unsurprising, although shocking, nevertheless, that this should be going on, and that the peanut gallery should be basically clapping.
Yeah, I'm so glad, Spencer, that you brought up The Coming Coup, because it's almost like this story is the bookend of what we got in trouble for publishing over a year ago. And that's what's been on my mind lately. I mean, at first glance, I thought, okay, well, maybe someone wants to get rid of Milley because even Colonel Vindman, right? Even scumbags like him were saying, this is terrible and this is unconstitutional. And if it's true, he should step down. And I thought, well, maybe someone wants to get rid of him, right? I mean, this is the only way people get fired in our day and age is you reveal the corruption of the people you want to get rid of. They're all part of the same party, but they're, different faction. And because they're all corrupt, every once in a while, all the cool kids gang up on someone to sacrifice them. And then, as a friend of ours pointed out to me just today, finally got through my thick skull, like, no, they're celebrating. This is the celebration parallax. He's burnishing his reputation, as Ryan said, and he's saying, I did the right thing, and he's celebrated as a hero for it. And this is just a reminder, because they're going to keep beating this drum, of what will happen in, say, 2024, if there's a close election, say, it could be 5 or 6 points that, say, President Ron DeSantis wins by. they're going to say the election's illegitimate, and this play is going to be there. And it should scare the hell out of Americans everywhere. I wish it would scare the hell out of the Republican Party more. There are some people who have been speaking out, but really this is just the rattling of the saber that the deep state firmly holds. The grasp is firm, and this is almost in your face, just saying, yes, he was a hero for doing this, for thwarting the will of the people as expressed through their duly elected president. And this is a good thing, actually. And this is now the precedent moving forward.
If we wanted to be as charitable as possible to Millie, I think there's also a way in which, and Spencer, you kind of brought this to mind for me, and James as well, with the talk of China and globalism, et cetera. I mean, there's a certain sense in which it becomes kind of a self-reinforcing paranoia / self-interest spiral. In the following sense, our Publius Fellow from 2 summers ago, Josiah Lippincott, has an excellent piece in the American Mind today and about Millie, and it's worth reading. I encourage our listeners to go read it. But one of his great lines in it is, "Our generals now are losers abroad and grifters at home." And a big part of the grift is to sit on all these boards of Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies, get well compensated for it once they get out of the service, out of their military service. And so you can see the strong pull at work here, right? The heights of our cultural and political and corporate institutions were all arrayed against Trump, especially post January 6th. They were shocked, appalled, disgusted. I mean, nobody on the right side of civilization, as far as they were concerned, could ever support such a man ever again, would have to denounce him. So you can see, even subconsciously, the Millies of the world showing, thinking, not even thinking, but just knowing that they really just had to break completely, utterly, even extra constitutionally, because it would mean the real constitution at work in America, the small c constitution for the last at least 30, 40, 50 years, was on their side and not on the side of the old constitution and the old normal chain of command with the commander-in-chief at top. So in that sense, this was inevitable, I suppose. Anytime any of these 2, 3, and 4-star generals, admirals, et cetera, get all the way up to the top where they are, they've been thoroughly co-opted by the bureaucratic mindset that's at work. And they're also corrupted by the prospect of cashing in once they're out. And to be on the wrong side of history, that is on the right side of Trump, would mean no payday. So it all makes perfect sense.
I think that what Matt is saying about the openness, the brazenness of this revelation is really crucially important. And as he also indicated, this should galvanize a lot of people. I'm not sure that it will. I mean, I'm thinking now in this context of what just happened in California, the failure of Republican turnout, the loss of the recall election, which was, seemed like it was coming for some time. But in the lead up to it, there was all sorts of talk about, well, they're doing this with mail-in ballots, and they're, making preparations to throw out people's votes or to, make it look like they've already voted. And all of those things, I think, are totally plausible and reasonable things to be concerned about. But at the other end of it, they don't even need to resort to that kind of subterfuge anymore. At a certain level, there is a growing and ever, self-reinforcing power structure in this country that consists of a minority, I think, of people still, but of extremely credentialed, unjustifiably credentialed people who will never lose their jobs, who will never face accountability, who aggrandize themselves and enrich themselves at the expense of the blood and treasure of the American people. And it's structural. It's not some kind of mistake or thing that they're doing because, whoops, they just happened to get this one a little bit wrong, guys. It's because they really do believe that they're better than you, that they know better than you, that the things you want to see done in this country are fundamentally unconstitutional and illegitimate, and therefore any means are acceptable to thwart you. They've made that plain, I think, now for nigh on over a year at least, and it should give everybody reason for extreme concern that they are now basically saying it outright in the open. I mentioned Klaus Schwab earlier, the Davos man extraordinaire, and one of the things he just recently said was that our problem is not a globalization problem, but a lack of global government, global leadership, global power. This is a philosophical commitment that they have, and any Republican or pretender to Republican leadership that doesn't understand that and isn't ready to fight it on those terms isn't worthy of your vote.
Speaking of globalists who don't know what time it is, I wanted to highlight George W. Bush, the only president who actually gave a speech on 9/11, current or former. Trump showed up at NYPD and NYFD stations unprompted to do what he does best, which is glad hand with the working and middle class folks that he's known so well in New York for so long. Biden attended a memorial, but did not really speak. But George W. Bush, fittingly in a way, at the 20th anniversary of 9/11, it makes sense for the president who presided over our response to 9/11 to speak, have some words. It was not that inspired a performance. A good portion of the speech was the normal stuff, decently delivered, honoring the dead from Flight 93, the heroes who brought down that plane and saved it from slamming into what we thought might have been the U.S. Capitol or maybe the White House. We're not really sure. That's all well and good and worthy of remembrance, and that was fine. But he just couldn't help himself, or his speechwriters just couldn't help with themselves. I do wonder if Michael Gerson wrote this. I wouldn't be surprised at all, or had a big hand in it. But I just wanted to read the sort of main 3 paragraphs that have been getting a lot of attention from not just pro, rah MAGA folks, but even seasoned reporters who like Byron York, who, I think he probably voted for Trump twice. I'm not sure, but he's not an uncritical cheerleader of Trump. And so we shouldn't regard the disgust from people like York as merely the product of partisanship. He thought that this was some shameful conduct by W as well. Here are the offending paragraphs. After the normal stuff, we try to make spiritual sense of all these events. We have to honor the brave people on Flight 93 who acted bravely and saved us from worse. And then he says the following: as a nation, our adjustments have been profound. Many Americans struggle to understand why an enemy would hate us with such zeal. The security measures incorporated into our lives are both sources of comfort and reminders of our vulnerability. And we have seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only across borders, but from violence that gathers within. There's little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home, but in their disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit. And it is our continuing duty to confront them. After 9/11, millions of brave Americans stepped forward and volunteered to serve in the armed forces. The military measures taken over the last 20 years to pursue dangers at their source have led to debate. And then he had a kind of half smirk when he delivered that line. Kind of somewhat self-deprecating, I think it was meant. But one thing is certain: we owe an assurance to all who have fought our nation's most recent battles. Let me speak directly to our veterans and people in uniform. The cause you pursued at the call of duty is the noblest America has to offer. You have shielded your fellow citizens from danger. You've defended the beliefs of your country and advanced the rights of the downtrodden. You've been the face of hope and mercy in dark places. You've been the force for good in the world. Nothing has followed. Nothing can tarnish your honor or diminish your accomplishments. To you and to the honored dead, our country is forever grateful. And then finally, this, not his closing paragraph of the speech, but really the closing for this section of the speech. In the weeks and months following the 9/11 attacks, I was proud to lead an amazing, resilient, united people. When it comes to the unity of America, those days seem distant from our own. A malign force seems at work in our common life that turns every disagreement into an argument and every argument into a clash of cultures. So much of our politics has become a naked appeal to anger, fear, and resentment. that leaves us worried about our nation and our future together. So much to unpack in these 3 paragraphs here. Just as a start, I mean, the tone deafness of it in a way is remarkable. I mean, the security measures incorporated into our lives are both sources of comfort and reminders of our vulnerability. I don't know that I regard TSA and DHS's daily kind of incompetencies and indignities, especially for those of us that fly a lot, to be either sources of comfort or reminders of vulnerability. They seem to me to be the rolling humiliation that we suffer at the hands of our ruling class, bipartisan as it is, that decided the best response at home to being attacked on home soil is, to paraphrase our colleague Angelo Codavilla, to change our way of life permanently rather than to go abroad and do swift violence to make sure that others change their way of lives when they mess with us. Leaving that aside, I mean, the allusion to January 6th is obvious with the determination to defile national symbols. I think that it's hard to read that as anything other than a reference to the Capitol business on January 6th. And just the equation of pro-Trump agitators, many of whom, as we've talked about ad nauseum and many have covered, were around on January 6th to kind of make their frustrations known. They had no grand plan, as even the FBI has admitted, to voice some insurrection on the government or anything like that. And then he praises all the veterans. I mean, there were quite a few veterans voicing their anger and disgust on January 6th. And then finally to lay somehow vaguely at the feet of Trump and his followers, strife, resentment, anger, fear, and culture wars. It's just remarkable. And also, I'll just close with this. Shows surprisingly, it's just pusillanimous from Bush, who was called Hitler. Bush Hitler, remember that? Bush Hitler, and called all manner of things for his conduct of the war on terror and all manner of things for his culture warrior issues, especially abortion, which he held sincerely, I think, but nonetheless was excoriated by the left for, to come sort of groveling to the normal narrative of the establishment and a good portion of the left here in this speech on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. It's just, the whole thing beggars belief. It is frankly shameful.
Yeah, a few of those passages brought me pain, unwelcome pain. And one of them was about the security theater. You would think that if you had to defend our current arrangements, which are presumably going to continue until the end of space and time, you would say that, well, they may be uncomfortable, but at least they make us stronger. But instead, what Bush said was, well, we may still be weak, but at least we're more comfortable, which is just the opposite of sort of the messaging that you would want to hear, even just as a stab at trying to justify what we almost endure every time we travel by air. But more substantively than that, out of one side of his mouth, he says that the bad guys in America don't like pluralism. And then he turns around and laments the increased clashes among cultures in America. And it's like, that's pluralism, my friends. There's salutary pluralism has always been part of the American experience and American life. And guess what? That involves frictions. That involves people raising their voices, raising their tempers. It's not going to be Jürgen Habermas style discourse democracy when you have real pluralism. And, you're going to have contestation. You're going to have, pushing and shoving, politics not being beanbag. This is stuff that's always been with us. In some cases, it's been, much more rowdy and dangerous than it is today. You just go back looking through the historical record, people getting tarred and feathered for real, not just as a metaphor. The rough and tumble of American politics has always been caught up with regionalism and localism, that, people making claims to how America should be as a nation, but always some sort of deep-seated recognition that any kind of American government that just terraformed the entire populace into sharing one sort of monoculture would be an unjust government, totally at odds with our form of governance, totally at odds with our folk ways and our shared mores as Americans at that higher level than our various subcultures, but still running quite strongly through them all. So I just found that to be, like you said, sort of characteristically Gersonian turns of phrase and patterns of thinking, which were not serving us well in 2003 and are not serving us well today.
There's something, I think, there's like a through line here, back in, as you say, James, to 2003, a rhetorical through line of just this kind of insidious vagueness. And I don't think it had ever really been driven home to me until this speech, the way that Bush, perhaps because cowed by the very ruling class in whose pocket he now seems to be, was never really able to come out and call a spade a spade. And, I've never been one who was pounding his fist on the table for an all out clash of civilizations between, I don't know, the church and Islam or whatever. But I did think that at the time, we were, if we're going to war against a radical faction of Islam, call it a radical faction of Islam. And the inability to really put words on that, and the sort of studious dedication to ignoring uncomfortable basic truths. I remember when he said that every nation, every people at some basic level longs to be free, which nobody would ever say if they had read the book of Exodus one time through with a degree of care, right? If only we could go back to Egypt and be slaves. This is a person who was totally comfortable speaking in the language of euphemism and sort of soft, comfortable untruths. And that was I think part and parcel of his unwillingness, as Angelo Codavilla pointed out time and again, his unwillingness to, name an aim of victory, to pursue it in a way that was direct and straightforward, and had clear, definable measures, and therefore the ability of this kind of approach to things to just easily morph into a glob of kind of general hostility toward extremism of all kinds, which now finds its apogee in this speech, right? That really it's just maybe the cultural context between ISIS, the Taliban, and the insurrectionists of January 6th, that maybe those cultural contexts are sort of vastly different, have nothing to do with one another. Maybe, but if you look back, if you squint, if you pull your head away and you really just kind of gesture in a nice sort of classically liberal way, then you can assimilate them all to one another. What better way to play directly into the hands of those who do want to lie to you and tell you that January 6th was some kind of plotted insurrection that was fake? I mean, look, everything that you've been told about this event, as we now know, is effectively a lie. And the just gaseous emptiness of this Bush rhetoric lets in exactly the people who want now to basically turn you into the terrorist. Anyone who voted for Trump, anyone who ever thought that maybe Trump was okay, now you're as bad as ISIS. It's kind of, I don't know, it's tremendously disheartening.
Well, this is how you defang the right institutionally, is you make sure that the people at the top of the heap are, using their microphone, their megaphone, to just emit sort of, thought-like blobs, and anyone who's in the rank and file is squeezed out of online discourse, and that's it. That's your national conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have really much to add to this one. It's just part of the demoralization project when you see Bush, who seems forever weighed down by guilt. I guess that's one credit we could give him. He seems like a man trying to purge his sins with his paintings and everything else. And this is just one part of it, I mean, to repeat ruling class propaganda, part of the Borg, such that he can be hugged by Michelle and Barack Hussein Obama. And the irony, of course, is, as we've been saying, I mean, pluralism is not what they want. They want a one-party state. This kind of rhetoric is radical. Really, it's divisive, and it's intended to delegitimize half the nation. And I think what's sad about it, and what concerns me the most, is that there's a lot of good people I noticed online who are, leaning right, and they just refuse to admit to themselves what he was talking about. Like, well, maybe he wasn't talking about just January 6th. He also meant BLM and Antifa. You saw a lot of, yeah, exactly. And it's sad, but you saw a lot of people just saying, well, it's not really clear, and they couldn't bring themselves to, to admit what he was actually saying. And I think we see this over and over again as every week a new, crazy thing happens and things hit new levels. People try to cope in some way with some kind of denial, and it's hard to wrap your mind around, everything that's going on. And we're going to have to coalesce rhetorically and as a movement to grapple with reality as it is. And I think people it's still slipping out of our fingers.
Yeah, it's that's the symbol, Matt, of Bush hugging Michelle. And we're, for the record, we're not against in principle bipartisan hugging, but the sometimes nice.
The heavy petting is
after a long day. No, it's but it's it really reflects the very little daylight between the modern progressive project of, say, the Obama administration and that exemplified in the rhetoric of especially the second Bush administration, with the second inaugural being front and center. I mean, if our goal is to end tyranny in our world, and every human heart ultimately longs for freedom, it doesn't seem to me there's much daylight between that and Obama's favorite Martin Luther King Jr. quote, which is that though the arc of the universe is long, it's always bending towards justice. And you said Bush, in a way, is a perfect encapsulation of this dual track tendency, which is kind of progressivism, which in many ways is born of a kind of social gospel Protestantism or disillusionment after the Civil War, the witch's brew of those together. Woodrow Wilson, of course, famously a Protestant minister's son, and many of the other progressives as well, and the kind of Protestant millenarianism of I think I still butchered that of Bush, and the kind of unthinking or unreflective modern evangelical movement. I don't mean to indict all of it, but I think that there's that tendency there, and it's just the interesting and messy way in which I think our bipartisan sort of establishment, though they may disagree quite a bit on, say, abortion, share, I think, a similar view of where we are in history and the status of nature and reason, and the problems that we face as a country. That's my kind of fancy way of saying that the shared characteristic of our uniparty seems to be a certain kind of historicism, where we all know that we're heading towards something good, and nothing all that distasteful or unsettling or tyrannical can get in our way. We just all have to kind of keep our heads down and stick to the narrative and not be too extreme, and all will be well. I think that's the farthest thing from the truth for any of us who remain good students of political history and the history of ideology, especially in the modern world, and their interaction with state power, let alone the bigger question, fancy question of the cycle regimes and everything else. So it's just another data point in our deep divisions and disagreements over fundamentals here in the US of A. Well, so W, we were going to also talk about the vaccine mandate, which we'll get to, but I think James has to leave us a little early. So I didn't have it on the official agenda, but we could just say a few words given the results overnight of the California recall election, which, I'll give, well, we should give a half mea culpa, right? I think on the podcast, we at points entertained hope against hope for the possibility of the recall of Newsom. But I will say, I think Matt, me, James, I mean, all of us really, ultimately, if I think at certain points and in various ways over the last 6 months said, if we had to put $1,000 on it, we weren't going to bet against Newsom surviving. That would have been a bad bet, and we knew it. And it turns out we were vindicated. But the scale of the loss, even if, as Spencer alluded to, even sort of handicapping for a decent amount of fraud, and by decent I just mean normal emergent behavior, ballot harvesting, everything else. I mean, there were so many vested interests in Newsom surviving, from the unions to all these other organized interests in the state of California, to think that there wasn't any, to think there wasn't any thumb scaling would be naive, especially in a large and corrupt state like California. But even that aside, I mean, just no chance in hell that Larry Elder was going to came anywhere near unseating Newsom. The interesting thing to me is how is Newsom going to react? It's not been lost on some folks on Twitter, and I'm sure you guys all saw. LA County today, shocking today, said that they're going to require vaccines for bars, public sporting events, and I forget the third category, large gatherings of various kinds. I submit to a candid audience that timing was intentional. Today was the earliest they could have announced that, and it'll be interesting to see what Gavin, as Matt has pointed out, various venues over the last week or so, 2 weeks. Newsom is not a warm and fuzzy politician. You see the nastiness creep out, the arrogance creep out from time to time, and last night was no exception. It'll be interesting to see what he does or thinks he can do to kind of settle scores after this.
It is not very surprising, somewhat depressing. I've been thinking of, the way restive natives are dealt with in colonial regimes. Looks like we need to send out the governor general, like make a show of force and sort of, just like, this is like what Macron did during the yellow vests thing. He holed up for a while and, just hung on and waited for people to lose interest. I mean, there are all kinds of things that a regime can do to just stand pat and wait for the sounds of the spears rattling in the streets to fade back into the jungle. I mean, this is many white men were criticized or are criticized for having taken that approach toward governance in days of yore in the colonial era. And yet, we see these patterns where, Newsom pushes it as far as he can go and, oops, well, I guess I went a little too far. And, oh, well, shoot, it looks like this thing's really going to happen. And then you just, I guess I have to pick up the phone and, make some phone calls and, rally the troops and get the team to fly in from Washington and make a few appearances. And that just, that show of support is going to push the numbers down a little bit. And none of it feels very much like, quote unquote, our democracy. What it feels like is the regime does what it wants until enough people sort of say, oh, grumble, and then the regime makes a show of force, and then the grumbling dies down, and they do it all over again the next cycle. It's not very inspiring, and it's obvious that many Californians are not particularly interested in performing really any acts of citizenship, with the exception of periodically casting a ballot for one person or another. And we'll see how the what's sure to be the next wave of vax mandates goes. Some of these rules are going to be difficult to enforce. Some of the people whose job it is to enforce these rules are fairly disinclined to enforce them. It seems like what's going on in California and nationwide through the Biden administration is, giving people the opportunity to choose servility and servitude as a matter of ethical purity before really bringing the hammer down. Corporations, this is your chance to really prove how pure of heart you are. So, make the right decision. And unfortunately, it looks like, lots of people, when confronted with the choice between recognizing that they are slowly being engineered into a social credit system where servility is the rule, would prefer to get ahead of that occasion by demonstrating that no, I'm choosing this new way of life. I'm not being railroaded. I want this. This is, these are our preferences, and our leaders are respecting our preferences. And that's not politics either, at least not as it was understood when our form of government was put together. So this is a big to be continued for me, but not much of a ground for hope at this point.
Yeah, it's like, where do we even begin? I mean, it's disheartening, right, to say the least. The way in which this went down was, not even close, but not surprising. And I think, as we've said before, there's going to be a resurgence. It just adds fuel, like a big a big tanker full of fuel to the exit that's already happening in California. Someone recently got in touch with me who said they had surfed in the last couple of days, and lifelong Californian, and they're thinking, it's not long for the world for them. They're going to have to leave. People of all kinds will, be emboldened to leave. A lot of people weren't able to leave right away or quickly over the last year, but after this, you're going to see a lot more people get out, of course. And I would say, in thinking about it today and in the last few days, and talking to various people in the state behind the scenes, the story is, I'm going to blame it on the right. I mean, the story is really that they were like a frog in a pot, and there's plenty of blame to assign for how the state was destroyed. But, we're at the point now where no one, even people who opposed Newsom, whether they were on the right or not, no major players wanted to get into the donor game to fund this. And many people with a bird's eye view, I've spoken to, and they would say, look, people were just scared at the donor level to give money because they knew the Borg was out to get them, the national authorities, right? I mean, Biden, the administration, all of the left or the uniparty, whatever you want to call it, we're all on Newsom's side. They know Newsom has a lot of power, and the cartels that run the state have a lot of power. And to thwart them by supporting the recall was just not going to happen. And this is the one of the largest economies in the world, the biggest states in the country. What is it, 40 million people? Is that right? I mean, or live in California, and only one Democrat ran for office in the recall, and he was basically about smoking weed and playing video games. Like that's one person from the Democratic, but not one serious person in the Democratic Party was going to oppose Newsom. And no one from the elite class was going to stand up. And ultimately, that's the problem. Once you get in a one-party system like this, once you've established yourself, you make it so that no one can really stand up. And so you can have these little, as James calls them, colonial movements. The natives get restless, but no one can really support that or organize for real, lest they, face the wrath of the real powers that be. And that's the lesson of California. And if that's where the country's headed, then we're all screwed. And if we're going to learn from that lesson, it has to be aggressive moves on the part of the right in states where they still have power to thwart this and aggressively attack the left. What really destroyed California was not the left. It was Arnold Schwarzenegger and moderate Republicans and people on the right who were complacent and did not push hard enough and went along for way too long. And now, sadly, it's too late.
Yeah, I'm out online scrolling through the various responses that you get if you oppose vaccine mandates, or even just say people should be left free to, make their own medical decisions. And anytime you say that and it gets any level of attention, you inevitably swim into just the darker corners of the internet. And the responses that I'm looking at are like, these unvaccinated plague rats are dying in the street. I mean, I'm quoting, I'm not paraphrasing here. And so that gives you a sense of what James is talking about. I think people, lining up to sell their souls in the name of ethical purity. It's the oldest bargain in Satan's book, and the only reason we don't see it is because every time he does it a little different, and we're so focused on being better than the people who did it that other time that we walk right into it again. You only have to read your René Girard to know how this thing plays out. But in any case, the ugliness that you're seeing poured into the hearts of people by a regime that hates all of us and therefore wants some of us to hate others more passionately and deeply than they can possibly say or name. And just the way that those people's souls are being twisted and conformed into the image of these lizard people, it tells you where as James is saying, where that regime wants this thing to go, right? That's how they want us to feel toward one another. Meanwhile, there are still, I think, a sizable number of people who, many of them on the right, but some of them just kind of floating about aimlessly, feeling confused. There are a sizable number of people who just feel, incredibly overwhelmed by the seismic changes that they see happening. They don't have a serious way of understanding them, and they're being gaslit constantly or, bombarded by official regime messaging. And they want to find a sort of cogent way forward. And, there's all this talk now after the California election about should you flee California, should you stay? And there was talk about that before already. As Matt says, this is going to accelerate it. And obviously, those of us on this podcast have different approaches to that and have made different choices or, may make different choices in the future. But for me, the most cogent advertisement for fleeing these blue cesspools is that you get out at least from under the thumb of the sort of daily grind in which you are constantly being sort of psychically malformed into a tool of this absolutely spiteful regime. And so that doesn't mean that everybody around you is going to be sensible or know what time it is 100% of the time. You're still going to have to fight. You're still going to have to build. You're still going to have to talk to people who maybe don't agree with you or haven't, really thought things through in a way that we would all like. But, out here in Tennessee, for example, we are muddling along, right, in a direction that looks healthy. And the regime is going to come for us as it will come for every red state. It's already coming for Florida and Texas and Ron DeSantis. And, you're never going to be safe. But you do need somewhere that you can, whether it's, some pocket of California or a red state, you need somewhere that you can gather with the people that are at least in it with a fighting chance, so that you don't get just flattened under the thumb of this incredibly powerful regime, which wants nothing other than your submission and your soul.
Yeah, it's well put, Spencer. Well, let's close out. James had to leave us, go pick up his boy, but just close out with a brief discussion of this Biden vaccine mandate. I know you guys didn't quite get to it last week because there's a little, we were recording just before it dropped. What's to say? I mean, there's so much been said already from friends and fellow travelers and allies that is all on point. I would just say resist. I don't have to tell any of you, but resist the notion that somehow this is normal, that the federal government does this all the time. It's the sleight of hand performed by folks like David French, who likes to cite, military vaccine mandates. People love to cite, George Washington and the smallpox vaccine being required for the Continental Army. It's all really nonsense in the sense that, this is, in two senses at least, it's a national mandate, de facto mandate. It's going to affect employers of 100 employees or more. We've been talking privately that, it seems clear to us that some version of a vaccine mandate for flying is in the offing or will likely be in the offing. If it's this easy to get employers over 100 or more to require their employees, I don't see why the national airlines, which have been a kind of cartel in cahoots with the feds forever, wouldn't at the barest kind of nudging from the Biden administration enact the same. We'll see. A federal vaccine mandate across the whole country for a certain huge class of people in their day-to-day lives is pretty unprecedented. And the fact that it's getting implemented through OSHA, that is through the bureaucracy and the administrative state, with no congressional sign-off, just an invented rationale under OSHA's mandate to provide a safe workplace and under their emergency powers thereof, is very novel. I mean, the mechanism for it is not novel. It's been with us for a half century or so. That is administrative government, but it does, none of it portends well for the future of self-government in America. Not to beat a dead horse, but it's just one more data point in this devolution. And I said it on Twitter, and I'm repeating myself from tell me what you really think. So if you heard my latest one with Spencer, or will hear it, forgive me. But if you think this stops at the COVID vaccine to ensure a safe workplace, I have a bridge to sell you, because it won't stop there. Last I checked, the same rhetoric during COVID has been deployed, and it's all been amalgamated into talk about climate change and lockdowns, climate change, and to talk about health and systemic racism. So this is the entering wedge in a growing biomedical security regime that seems to be creeping across the Western world, in irony of ironies, kind of modeled on the Chinese's way of doing business with their social credit system and their response to COVID. It's none of it's good. I think I don't know what you Matt or Spencer think about this, but I think it's unpredictable how this is going to shake out, or how it's going to roll across the country, and what the reaction to it is going to be. I think the Biden administration really is playing with fire with this one, because you just have a healthy portion of the country, many millions of people who, just regard this as beyond the pale, as tyrannical, which it is in a certain sense for this disease. Really, there's a prophylactic, there's a wonderful sort of advanced treatment out there for it called the vaccine for anyone who wants it, anyone at risk. And it's just, even though many have died from COVID, in the broad scheme of things, the Spanish flu, this is not. Smallpox, this is not. It's just so remarkably less deadly than anything else. It really is, close to a really bad flu. So all of that, I think all this, well, it'll be interesting to watch. I sympathize with our. Luckily, the Claremont Institute has fewer than 100 employees, so we're not subject to this at the moment. But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, and I hope, we keep saying this over the last year and a half, but I hope that this is really an overreach, and it will be the beginning of the end of this kind of brazen rule from this administration. But we shall see.
Yeah, that's my hope as well. And Ryan, as you say, I've been disappointed in this hope many a time over the last year and a half. But I do think that tells us something, which is, that doesn't make this any less outrageous. And it just means that it's not going to happen automatically, right? Those of us who understand what an obscene breach of trust this is, what a hideous intrusion into the lives and personal choices of not just the American people, but employers, right? And a violation of their rights as well. I mean, we're going to have to radicalize people about this. I do think that the conditions on the ground are there more and more. I talk to people who were way more worried about COVID than I was back at the beginning, who say basically, after I got vaccinated, I just decided I was going back to life as normal, and the rest of it just, I tried not to let it affect me as much as possible. So those are the people, right, that need galvanizing to understand fundamentally, crucially, right, that this is not about whether or not you chose to get vaccinated or whether you will in the future choose to get vaccinated. I mean, they put you into this position where you look unreasonable for saying categorically, no, this is not acceptable, because then it's like, oh, you're saying no to the vaccine. It's got nothing to do with the vaccine. The minute you're arguing with somebody over whether or not they got vaccinated and whether or not that's a betrayal of you or the party or whatever, you are playing right into their hand. You're doing exactly what they want the minute you enter for a second into that debate. This is not about the medical choice that you you make. This is about you and your fellow Americans refusing to be pushed this far. And I do think that the ability to galvanize that is there. I just think that it's not going to happen, automatically. We have to make it happen.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a black pill day on the side of the on that side of the quantum equation for me. At first, I thought this will not stand. This is just they know it won't stand in the courts, but they want to try to give cover to big business, I think, which is all true. Because big business wants to stay out of the political mess. And so, they give them cover by, well, look, the government is requiring this and it makes it easy for everybody. But I mean, the more I look around, I'm not really sure. I mean, again, we'll need Republican leaders or leaders to rise, but that's hard in a media ecosystem that's increasingly quasi-state run. And you certainly see a lot of people, I see it in myself, just thinking like, well, we're going to have to roll along with this. And, I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I think it needs to be resisted. I think people will rise up. I think millions of people disagree and realize how bad it is. But, we're living in a world in which, despite all this, new evidence coming to light, realizing that the numbers have been way off from the beginning when it comes to the danger that everyone really faces from the virus. You got at least half the country it's absolutely terrified that this is now a religion and there's nothing that can be done to persuade them otherwise. And especially if they've, already been vaxxed and been through they're just going to cling to these beliefs, this faith-based religion. And, I don't know. I mean, I think the right in some ways might be walking into a trap. We have to fight this, and they should be fighting it along the grounds that Spencer laid out. I think they should lean into the constitutional bit too, and say this is now, a post-constitutional state. When you look at Milley and everything else, that the Republicans should say that outright, that's how bad things are and fight it. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that there'll be a backlash. It seems to me that a lot of people want to go along and they want it all to go away. And they think somehow it'll go away if you just obey the dictates of the state. And again, I mean, I'll say the same thing I said about California nationally. The cowardice of the business community, just, we need to call this out. Like, we're not in a situation in which you can sit back and remain neutral when it comes to these debates. And, when people complain about politicians, look, politicians are always spineless. Complain about Conservatism Incorporated, think tankers and academics, or, when have they ever solved anything, right? I mean, if we're true to the reality of the situation, people should be saying, where the hell are the actual leaders in various communities throughout the country and nationally who know this is wrong and have resources and have positions of some kind of status? Where are they? And they're going to have to stand up, because that's the last thing remaining. And what I see are many people who, they know what's going on is wrong, but they're justifiably, scared of what will happen to them. And I think that's a nut that we really have to crack. We have to figure out a way how we can band people together in the business community to oppose this. And, if that doesn't happen, we don't have kind of a new donor class who rises to the challenge. Politicians they'll do what you say. I mean, right? I mean, this is the problem. You can blame the Republican Party all you want, and it's justifiable. But politicians always snap to the attention of the donors and whoever has money, right? And even if I'm not even asking for principled leaders. You can find people who will go out and fight for whatever you tell them to, who are spineless. But we don't have the donor class or the business groups that are doing that. And so, at some point, this complaint about the Republican Party having no leaders falls. It's just deaf. My ears are deaf to it, because who controls the Republican Party? Well, that's going to be whoever is willing to actually put skin in the game and pony up money and band together and start pushing forward the leaders we need. That's what didn't happen in California. There's probably still, some deluded souls in Orange County or wherever they're left who think they're going to save the state. But I think most people realize that it's gone. And that's going to happen to America unless we have people of means who are competent, who actually start paying attention and getting involved in American politics. That's my rant for the day.
That's a good one, Matt. I was recording the interview today with our friend Glenn Elmers about his book on Harry Jaffe, Soul of Politics. And the point he made, partly to the dissident right folks who, and even some of the radical traditionalists or the kind of Rod Dreher, Benedict Option inclined types. I realize Dreher sort of retrenched on that a little bit. But his message to them was, look, detachment is not going to work. If you're interested in greatness, strength, vitality, virtue, times of political crisis are your time to shine. And I think you're right, Matt, that, national politics has some dead ends in it right now, but there's a lot of energy across the states, including your now new home state of Texas. And people ought to roll up their sleeves. And this includes the donor class very much, as you say. Roll up their sleeves and take this as an opportunity to do great things for their country, or at least to start that work. So don't despair. We never do. But I think for the foreseeable future, we have to write off California and go mass together elsewhere. In Tennessee, too, where Spencer now is, both offer some opportunity. Well, good. Well, my thanks to you both. And thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our Washington, D.C. Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Rate us well, spread the word. We keep growing. We appreciate it. And thanks to, of course, the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Alyssa Lee. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.